Hey guys, this series of videos began with a very lighthearted tone, a lot of joking around, and a lot of laughter on camera. I think in part 2 you got to see my girlfriend Melissa really breaking down laughing quite often. And with this video, the 4th in the series, apparently from now on 51% of all the videos on my channel will be direct replies to Kanadajin3. In this video, I don't think there's going to be a single laugh or a single punchline. So it's become more and more serious, and I think the two sides of the debate have indeed disambiguated what it is that they're about. If you are an internet atheist watching this video, I want to start by pointing out to you that my position is, in a subtle and profound way, different from anything you've seen on YouTube before, because I'm not an atheist. I'm a nihilist. My problem with Islam, my problem with the Catholic Church, my problem with communism is not with particular beliefs, but with believing itself. I'm not merely a critic of the principles espoused by any one of these ideologies. I'm a critic of ideology. I'm a critic of a view of the world that proceeds from principle, from matters of principle. So in the most recent reply I've received from Kanadajin3, she's just doubling down on her position as already stated in this debate. She writes to me saying, quote, "Thank you for the video, but she fails to see why it is relevant to talk about racism in a certain country. The actions of individuals," she argues, "do not reflect the religion, do not reflect the principle of the thing." Now, the position she's adopting here is in no way unique to Islam. The contrast between what I have to say and what she has to say as a proponent of Islam is 100% identical to the position I'm in as a nihilist when I'm debating communists, and that's been a huge factor in my life, both because of the type of research I've done and simply where I've lived. I've lived in post-communist countries like Cambodia, and I've lived in countries that are still communist today, like Laos. It's very easy for the defendant of any one of these ideologies, Islam, communism, Catholicism, or even American imperialism, the American empire, or even Israel. It might make some Muslims watching this video might be very uncomfortable with recognizing that the type of rationale they're engaging in here works just as well in providing excuses for the modern nation state of Israel as it does in making excuses for the religion of Islam. But the difficult principle thing to get at here when you're dealing with believers face to face is to get them to recognize that the mode of reasoning they're engaged in is insincere, although they feel piously that it's the most sincere thing they can say or feel or evince, that in fact it is an excuse-making mentality. It's not even a sincere mode of reasoning. Kanadajin3 is inviting me to believe that the principle of the thing is more important than the particular people who espouse the principle. And that is the diametric opposite of what I believe. I do not think it's possible to look at massacres that were carried out under the orders of Lenin. Lenin was one of the dictators in Russia following after the Russian Revolution, Communist Revolution in Russia. I do not think it is possible to look at those massacres and dismiss them in the same way that Kanadajin3 dismisses massacres in the history of Islam, in the same way that Kanadajin3 dismisses the history of slavery in Islam, in the same way that she dismisses the historical reality and current present-day reality of racism in Islam. She dismisses all these things by referring to the purity of the principle, the matter of principle. Now, what we soon learn in practice is that this principle is something anyone can invent for themselves, and that even when they're claiming it's something they've discovered written in an ancient text, that it's something immutable, that they have no role in editing, in fact, they are picking and choosing. They are making an editorial selection from that ancient text so extreme that they might as well be making up a new religion out of thin air. Of course, this happens with Islam. Believe me, it also happens with Buddhism. Believe me, it also happens with Catholicism. What is the principle that a Catholic feels Catholicism represents that can be separated from the historical reality of what the Catholic Church did to Native Americans, to indigenous peoples, North America, or hey, South America. Look at what's now Brazil, Chile, etc. The historical reality of what Catholicism actually is, what it did, and its outcomes is much, much more important than the principle of the thing. And the problem is, again, the principle of the thing is so malleable. It's so easily reinvented in the minds of believers. We could claim that there is some immaculate principle for the Catholic Church that is in no way besmirched, in no way stained by the mere historical reality of what the Catholic Church did in South America or in North America for that matter. That genocide, mere massacres, mere crimes against humanity, mere slavery, mere racism, in no way touches the principle of the thing, not of what the Catholic Church is, but of what it ought to be. The problem I have here is with the very mode of thinking that proceeds from, as its first premise, a delusion not about what the world is, but about what the world ought to be. A mode of thinking that takes principles as something more real than reality itself. Historical reality is precisely what we must proceed from. We can't, as with the laws of geometry, start on a chalkboard to sketch out how a bridge is supposed to work, how a bridge is supposed to support the weight of a train as it goes across a chasm. On the contrary, simply put, politics does not proceed geometrically from a set of principles on a chalkboard. Instead, we're in a situation where we're looking at a bridge that collapsed and a whole bunch of people who died when the train went over that bridge and collapsed. And then on the other side of the world, in a totally different political context, totally different cultural context, people tried to build the same bridge using the same blueprint, and it collapsed. And lots of people died. And somewhere else on the other side of the world, people used the same blueprint, the same principles, and a bridge collapsed and died. And we're standing there looking at the rubble, trying to figure out, trying to put together rationally an explanation for what went wrong. What am I talking about here? If you're Muslim watching this video, please reflect on whether or not these excuses you make for the principle of the thing, whether or not you would extend these principles to the history of communism within Afghanistan. Afghanistan today is a Muslim country in a semi-colonial relationship with the United States of America. Before that, it was a Muslim country under the rule of independent Muslim extremists. You guys probably know that part of the story. There was a time when Afghanistan was a communist country. Would you make these same excuses for communism, being good in principle, being good in its intentions, despite the disaster that happened under communist rule in Afghanistan? Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, with no particular connection to Afghanistan, you can look at the reality of a communist society in North Korea. You can look at the reality of a communist society in Laos, in Vietnam, in Cuba, in South America to some extent. We have completely independent cultural examples. Indeed, even just the contrast between Russia and China, their respective experiments with communism, it's astounding how much they have in common. It's astounding the extent to which different people in different cultures at different times took this same blueprint, tried to build a bridge, and it collapsed. And among the features of that collapse were racism, genocide, persecution of ethnic minorities, and yes, of course, mass starvation, topics I'm not going to get into in this video. During the life of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, I will give you a link below this video to an essay I wrote about it. You can read about unbelievable, I really mean that, unbelievable massacres and persecutions of Jews within Russia under Russian communism. I think the very first group to face ethnic cleansing, to face genocidal repression in Russia right after the communist revolution were the Cossacks. That's no joke. It's a really terrible chapter of history. And repression of ethnic groups, extermination of ethnic groups, This was a feature of communism again and again in diverse places around the world. Actually, I've heard Muslims complain that Muslims themselves were persecuted by communism within Cambodia. Another interesting chapter in this history, the treatment of Muslims by communists in some cases. Would you accept what Kanadajin3 says here in defending Islam, in defending communism, in defending Catholicism, or indeed in defending the modern nation-state of Israel or the American empire abroad? What Kanadajin3 says is that the actions of individuals in no way impugn the principle of the thing. They in no way touch the reality of what the religion is. And from my perspective, that is the fiction of what the religion ought to be. Can you not recognize that there is a principle the United States was pursuing when it bombed Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos? Can you not recognize that there are people who can make a principled defense of the United States military and its actions, whether in the devastation of Laos, the devastation of Cambodia, or examples that this audience may be more familiar with, the conquest of Afghanistan, the disaster of the interaction of Iraq? If people say, yes, but what America represents can never be known from a particular historical figure like George W. Bush or Abraham Lincoln or George Washington. No. They can defend this by claiming there's a principle here. And there's a principle that they insist they alone can define by working from some sacred text, whether that text is the Constitution of the United States of America or the Communist Manifesto. That there is some sense in which they will claim the beliefs and conduct of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the dictator of Russia, that the conduct of Joseph Stalin, dictator of Russia, that their conduct or misconduct, the outcomes of their decisions, are something that you need to understand as completely separate from the principle of what communism is itself. The principle is nothing. What you're being asked to do in this mode of thought is to disregard everything and focus your attention exclusively on nothing. What can we learn from the historical reality of actually existing communism? Everything. It's profound, it's baffling, it's unbelievable. I'll give this link to this article I wrote about a chapter of history I'm sure none of you have ever heard before. It's a fascinating chapter of history in East Asia where Russian communists did carry out anti-Semitic massacres. They did carry out anti-Japanese massacres, and they carried out anti-Cossack massacres. So there was ethnic cleansing going on, there was starvation, there was chaos, there's unbelievable violence under communism. By studying that example, the unfolding of these historical particulars, we can learn so much that's valuable. And by disregarding those details, to instead focus on the principle of what communism ought to be, we learn nothing. And indeed, from my perspective, the religious mentality is one of the same, whether the example is the Catholic Church in South America, the Russian Empire, the Russian Revolution, communism, or what have you, or if we're looking at Islam and the rarely discussed question of the history of Islam and slavery and racism in Mauritania. Now, some of you will claim that there's something really significant about working from the primary source text here. Sometimes there is. I mean, is it significant? If you want to understand the American bombing of Vietnam, is it important to read the American Constitution? Well, yes, sure. You can understand a lot of things about American politics. Conversely, if someone said to you, no, the American empire is not racist. Just look at the U.S. Constitution. There's nothing in there about bombing Vietnam. There's nothing in there about Vietnamese people and Laotian people being not equal to Americans. That is ridiculous. When you're trying to invoke the sacred purity of this source text, to disregard the reality, the very complex reality of racism in a context like the United States trying to conquer Vietnam, trying to conquer Cambodia, trying to conquer Laos. Was racism a factor in American foreign policy towards Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos? Yes, it was a factor. Is it the only factor? Did they start those wars just because they're racist? No, of course not. Okay? Is racism a factor in understanding the reality of Mauritania today? Is racism an important factor? Is racism an important factor in understanding Islam as it actually exists in Mauritania today? Is racism an important factor in understanding the role of Islam in slavery in Mauritania today? Yes. Now, it's not a complete explanation. You're not just going to say, well, people are racist, therefore that's the whole story. Of course it's an important factor. Is it possible for people to focus on the mere facts of history, so much so that they exclude or ignore important questions of principle? Maybe that is possible. Maybe it's possible for someone to focus on the reality of the United States using torture in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, to focus on the use of torture so much, the practical reality, the historical reality of what the United States did in torturing people, that they ignore questions of principle, that they ignore the fact that in the United States Constitution, it says that America is against torture. I've never known anyone who had that problem. I've never known anyone who was so invested in the mere facts of what actually happens in history and planet Earth that they ignore those questions of principle. On the contrary, I think those people tend to be deeply involved in drawing our attention to the contrast between those statements of principle. The United States claimed it would never use chemical weapons, it would never use biological weapons, and they did. They claimed they would never engage in this kind of torture, and they did, etc., etc. It's those people who really care about that. On the contrary, the problem I see again and again is people who want to lead us down the rabbit hole of the true believer, of the ultimate conformist. The Kanadajin3 has gone down here, who want us to believe in the principle of the thing, primarily, exclusively. They want us to believe so much in the principle of the thing that we're willing to disregard 1,000 years of history, that we're willing to disregard the world as it actually is, just for the sake of our pious hope, our pious belief in the world as it ought to be. And that plays out the same way whether your belief is in what communism is, what it ought to be, or the American empire is and ought to be, or Islam or Judaism as it exists in the modern state of Israel today. The difference between myself and other atheists on the internet, or the difference between myself and these true believers, is much more extreme than you might at first believe. I describe myself not merely as a nihilist, but an historical nihilist. Many people will tell you to study history just to learn the lessons of history. And ultimately, that's not my point here at all. I think that people who sincerely study any of these episodes in history, any of these ideologies, any of these collapsed bridges, if you like, to use my former image, the point is not that they just examine one collapsed bridge and come to the conclusion, this was a disaster. I think that with time, with real depth of understanding, with profound introspection and examination of the human condition and the reality of each of these disasters that ideology leads to, I think that the study of history itself is profoundly incompatible with belief. I think that a true appreciation for what history is and for how human beings who have the best of intentions, human beings who tell you sincerely that in the colonization of Canada, they were going to set up schools for the forced assimilation of the Indigenous people, the forced assimilation of First Nations, Indigenous people, Native Americans, American Indians, whatever you want to say, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Mohawk, the Dene. There are people who will tell you, still to this day, so sincerely, that what they were doing in principle was bringing civilization and literacy to people who had none of their own, people who were not civilized and who were illiterate. And on the level of just examining the principle of the thing, isn't that easy to believe in? Isn't it easy to support such a positive, pious principle that is presented to you as a way of helping people? And isn't it so much harder to examine the disconnect between those positive human intentions and the unbelievably horrible human outcomes? Isn't it so much harder to learn from the reality of what history really is? But when we do that, one disaster or another. Residential schools in Canada, forced assimilation of indigenous people, whether in Canada or in the Soviet Union. Under communism, there are parallel situations with them forcibly assimilating their native people. It's amazing the extent to which, in a Christian and a secular context, human beings can reinvent many of the same evils. When we learn from history, what we learn, I think, finally, maybe not even in your first 10 years of learning from history, but finally, inexorably, inevitably, what we learn is that there is nothing to be believed in, that all beliefs are false, that all beliefs are dangerous, that we can't look amongst the rubble of one of these collapsed bridges to find the good and pure principles of geometry that were once written on a blackboard, that what we can do and what we must do is learn from historical reality. Historical reality is all we have. But in that rubble, the tremendously hopeful and the tremendously positive thing is human mutability, is the potential for positive change. That knowing what we know now, if we don't disregard the reality of what went wrong in Mauritania, the reality of what went wrong in Ontario, Canada, where Kanadajin3 comes from, the various disasters, genocide, and worse that we can learn from the history of the Catholic Church, from the history of Islam, from the history of communism, that it would be so easy for us to do better next time. That, for me, is the sense in which nihilism is endlessly optimistic compared to any particular belief. Believers end up trying to cling to one principle or another. They end up trying to defend that principle, the imaginary purity of that principle, against the unbelievable historical reality of what happens when that principle is put into practice again and again and again. Nihilists instead get to look around at the rubble and say, hey, I'm just trying to do something positive here. What can I do that'll make a positive difference? And the answer is something, not nothing. Whereas belief makes you beholden to an abstraction that is, in truth, worse than nothing at all.